everybody. My name's Ted Snell. It's my great pleasure to welcome and introduce Ian McLean today. Firstly, I wish to acknowledge that I am talking to you from Whadjuk Noongar land in Perth, Western Australia, and I acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people as the original owners and spiritual and cultural custodians of their country. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And I also acknowledge the First Nations peoples from around the globe, from wherever you are all accessing this talk this morning. And we thank them for sharing their land and their country with us. It is my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Ian McLean. Ian is the Hugh Ramsay Chair of Australian Art History at the University of Melbourne. And as I'm sure many of you know, he has published widely on Australian art and particularly on Aboriginal art. Formerly, Ian was a colleague at UWA before he moved to the University of Wollongong. In that time when Ian was in Perth, he made a huge impact, as he does wherever he goes. His lively mind and his ability to bring an arsenal of information to bear on his interpretation of artworks makes him both an extraordinary teacher and a wonderful colleague who can radically change the way we see the world around us. As I said before, he's published extensively on the subject of Australian art, and particularly Indigenous and contemporary art, including the germinal study, How Aboriginals Invented the Idea of Contemporary Art in 2011, in which he explores the ways in which Indigenous Australians have responded to the invasion of their country through their art and embraced modernism, but on their own terms. More recently, of course, he's published Indigenous Archives, The Making and Unmaking of Aboriginal Art with Darren Jorgensen in 2017, and Rattling Spears, a great title, Ian, A History of Indigenous Australian Art in 2016. So it is my great pleasure to welcome you, Ian, and to invite you to give this plenary address.
Thank you very much, Ted, for your kind words. Gives me a big head. As I'm sure most of you are aware, it's now, there has been, I think, for nearly 20 years now, I guess an institutional practice to acknowledge Indigenous, the Indigenous owners of the land that we're on. So I won't repeat Ted's acknowledgement, except Ted is on the other side of Australia in Perth to me, and I'm on Awabakal land up in Newcastle, or what the Awabakal people call Mullumbimba, which means a sort of reedy river, which is the big Hunter River that flows through the middle of Newcastle. Anyway, today, my plan today, I've got about half a dozen slides here, which I'll talk to. And my plan is to consider the conference theme, Voices from the Edge, negotiating the local in the global, through one of the two signature artworks of the National Gallery of Australia, the Aboriginal Memorial, which you can see on the screen as it is currently installed in the NGA. And the really quite unoriginal thesis that I want to put to you, or I'm proposing to discuss, or for us to discuss, is that the most powerful vector or creative principle, in other words, the negotiator here in the negotiation between the local and global, is the nation state, which in mediating the local and the global, or facilitating that mediation, largely determines what each is, does, and means. And so the question that arises from that is, can we then ever really know the local, or for that matter, the global? Is it always, in a sense, escaping our interrogation? Now, the nation state creates the local and global through its domestic and international fronts. It even has, departments and ministers that administer these different fronts. And so it has a localizing centripetal action and then a globalizing centrifugal actions. And it's as if in this age that we live in, which is the age of the nation state, the local and global are the inner and outer faces of the nation state. So what I'm suggesting that then I should also say that from the perspective of the local, the nation state is always in the global arena. Whereas from the perspective of the global, the nation state is in the local arena. So I'm proposing that these terms, that form the theme of the conference, local and global, and negotiating them, are quite fluid terms that depend very much on the perspective that we're looking from as to the meanings that they start to accumulate. Now, so at this point, I want to zero in on the Aboriginal memorial and just say that in the case of the Aboriginal memorial, as it manifests here on this slide in the National Gallery of Australia, its locality and its globality, because I want to argue that the Aboriginal memorial also has these two faces. It's speaking to a local community and to a global community, is here in its manifestation here, created through the lens of the nation state represented by the National Gallery of Australia. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever been to Canberra, which is the capital of Australia, but it's very laid out a little bit like Washington, except there's a lake in the middle. On the south side of the lake is the Parliament House, the National Art Gallery. Connecting the National Art Gallery with a bridge is the High Court, and next to that is the National Library. And then on the other side of the lake, up on the hill, is the War Memorial. And they're the institutions, in a sense, that I'm going to talk about and try and locate this artwork in and try and help us, I guess, think about what this artwork is about. And I guess I should just add that a more considered discussion would have to include the other discourses and discursive spaces of the nation state, of which there are many. So here it is in the National Gallery of Australia, in a specially designed space at the entrance. It was specially designed in 1910. And being at the entrance, when you walk in, the entrance is on the edge of the gallery. It's not in the center of the gallery. So this artwork is actually disconnected from the central work of the gallery, because in the center of the gallery, the job, if you like, of the National Gallery is to narrate the nation. And so this work is not actually where the nation is being narrated. It's at the entrance, the first thing you go past. It's very similar to how we began this lecture. It's very similar to an Aboriginal welcome to country. And I think the National Gallery has specifically planned it as that, so that, as you enter the gallery, there's a welcome to country. Ironically, this artwork is not from the Indigenous country of Canberra, but from on the other side of this very large continent, Ramingining, which we'll come to. Now, we could discuss this placement further because it hasn't always been in that spot. The work was purchased in 1988, and where it was first exhibited was in the International Sculpture Gallery. So it was next to large Joseph Beuys artwork, Brancusi's famous birds, and a couple of other international sculptures. So its context there, if you like, was global modernist contemporary art. Its context here now is very different. As I said, it's a sort of a welcome to country context. After being in the International Sculpture Gallery, it moved to what then was the entrance, but it was the entrance to the main galleries, not the entrance to the museum. So here it's at the entrance to the museum, and then you go up escalators and long corridors till you get to the actual gallery. There you had to walk through that path that you see there, although it was a different layout, I'll show you later. You had to walk through that path to get into the main gallery. And so it was much more part of how the nation was being narrated, if you like, because you walk through there and then into the story, if you like, that the National Gallery is telling. So what I want to talk about now, I hope well, that's clear. What I want to talk about now is how it got into the National Gallery, because there were very complex negotiations, which is, you know, one of the things I want to talk about, involved between the nation state here, and also the global here, represented by the International Sydney Biennale. So next slide, hang on. On here, you see photographs of all the people involved. Can you see the photograph on the bottom right with the 3 people, or is everyone? I've got all these people's faces there. Oh, that's better. These are the negotiators, if you like. Very, very simply, before I get into the complexity of it all, I'll tell you a little bit about all these people. Very simply, the War Memorial, as it's called, the Aboriginal War Memorial, the Aboriginal Memorial, as it's called, was first shown at the Sydney Biennale, the International Sydney Biennale, if you like. And from there, the National Gallery, from there it went up to the National Gallery, if you like. The National Gallery purchased it. And so it goes from the global context of the Sydney Biennale up into the nation state context of the National Gallery. So who are these people? If we start, we'll start on the far right with the guy in the singlet called John Mundine. John Mundine is the chief negotiator here. It was the memorial, the Aboriginal memorial was his idea. His job was the art coordinator at Bulla Bulla Arts, which is the art centre at this remote Indigenous community called Ramingining. So he had been, for a couple of years before 1988, he had this idea to do this memorial, which he saw as a war memorial, which we'll get to in a minute as to what that's about. And he tried to have it placed. I think he even tried to have it placed in the Australian War Memorial, but he tried to have it placed in a couple of places. And then when the Sydney Biennale came up in 1988, he convinced Nick Waterlow, who's also in that picture, who was the artistic director of the Sydney Biennale, for it to be placed in the Biennale. Nick Waterlow was very enthusiastic about the whole idea. The reason he was enthusiastic is that 1988 was the bicentenary of the invasion of Australia, if you like, or the colonisation of Australia. And the Australian Indigenous community had decided to boycott the 1988 celebrations. And the Biennale, because it's in a sense funded by the state, was seen as part of those celebrations. And so John Mundine and Nick Waterlow wanted to address the Biennale in some way, not the Biennale, the bicentenary in some way. This was his way of doing it. And then to raise the money to do it, because Nick Waterlow didn't have enough money to have 200 poles made. We'll get to what that means in a minute. He and John Mundine approached the man in the middle, James Mollison, who's the director of the National Gallery of Australia. And James immediately said, I'll put up the money on condition, I'll put up the money for the cost on the condition that it comes into the collection. And you will have noticed in the in the first slide, I had a little quote from James Mollison where he said it's one of the greatest works of art ever to have been made in this country, which is what he said when he purchased it. Oops. Now, for a couple of years before those negotiations went on, John Mundine then struck a deal with James Mollison. He said, I'll agree to that on condition that the National Gallery shows it continually. It never takes it, or it never takes it away. It's on permanent display. And so it has become one of the signature artworks. Ironically, the other signature artwork is Blue Poles, which James Mollison is standing in front of there. So the two signature artworks are the 200 poles in the memorial and Jackson Pollock's Blue Poles. Now, before those negotiations were going on, and also while they're going on, John Mundine is then negotiating with the local. So far we have Nick Waterlow, who in a sense is in this case representing the global, James, who's representing the nation state, James Mollison. And then if we come down to the bottom left slide, you'll see two elderly men, and they're the ones I really want to talk about, and a younger man, Johnny Duraku. Johnny is David Malangi's son, who's there to dance, to learn, and also to look after his dad, because they are a long way away from Ramingining. Now, those two men, Petty Danghu and David Malangi, are the two senior, were then, they're both dead now, were the two senior men in 1988 that John Mundine, as the art coordinator, works with and has to do everything through. When John took up the job as art coordinator back in the early 80s, these two men became very prominent in his life because they, in a sense, mediated him into the community as the art coordinator. So Paddy Danghu is a more senior man than David Malangi. He's a senior ceremonial leader, but David Malangi is their most famous artist and a person that you can probably tell a bit by how he's standing, who was very used to working in and negotiating with the Western art world because he was a famous artist. He'd been working at a very high level since the 1960s. And so that's, and what Paddy and David did, they then had to negotiate with the local community on how this was going to be made. The original idea that was that a few of the senior artists would make the poles. There's a lot of poles, 200 poles, so it's a lot of work. At the community, perhaps through Petty Danghu and David Malangi working them up, I don't know, but the whole community, which is about 800 people, decided to get involved. So all up, there were 43 artists involved in the making of the poles. And this is where we come to Paddy Fordham up the top there. Paddy Fordham, sorry, I should preface that Ramingining is in Yolngu country, what's called Yolngu country. I'll explain that again. Paddy Fordham is not Yolngu, I don't think. He happened to be in town, as were a couple of other artists at the time that all this talk is going on, and they want to be part of it as well. Paddy Fordham, in fact, did more poles than anyone else because he's the only one representing his community, which is several hundred kilometres away. So that what's going on at the local level is very interesting, but it ends up getting lost in the final thing where it looks like much more of a sort of singular community effort. So we can ask more quick. We can talk about that further if you like. But what that means is that the Aboriginal Memorial had at least two major manifestations, but we could argue it had three manifestations. Its first manifestation was really as a concept before it's made in Ramingining, and it's existing purely within a local context, but with John Mundine, and there on the left is David Malungi and John Mundine talking, I presume, from the photograph, which John gave me about this idea, because the memorial, the idea, is itself about something much bigger than Ramingining. It's about colonisation. The second and the main manifestation to which Malungi and Mundine are really working towards, I guess, is the Sydney Biennale manifestation in the middle there. And you'll see that it looks very different to the National Gallery of Art manifestation, which is how it exists now. It was in a much darker space. It was in a large warehouse on Sydney Harbour, and within that warehouse were other installations. It was the sort of main area where installation art was exhibited for the Biennale. And the memorial, the Aboriginal memorial, was put at the end of the warehouse, so you had to walk through half a dozen other installations by international artists like Rebecca Horn, Herman Nitsch, Arnold Frainer. I think Boltanski had a work in there as well. So you walk through these contemporary, international, or global, shall we say, artworks, and then you come to the Aboriginal Memorial, which is the largest installation, and which for Nick Waterlow, the director, was the major artwork of the Biennale. The second very important factor for both for the local, if you like, for Mundine, and also Malungi, was that it was a performance artwork. And the artwork lives, if you like, at its opening when there are local Yolngu performers singing and dancing through the poles. The poles here sit on dirt from Ramingining, and they're positioned in a particular way, which I'll come through, but I'll come to in a minute. But they're positioned in a way for the audience to walk through them, a bit like in the National Gallery of Australia. So that it's an immersive artwork, and in a sense an interactive artwork. And then finally, its art manifestation in the National Gallery of Art. I already talked to you about how that's placed. You'll notice there's no longer dirt there, but sort of riverbed stones. There's been a lot of discussion about that and why, what are the riverbed stones doing there, etc., which we don't need to get into. But we can come back to that too. I now want to go on and talk about what actually is the memorial. What's it about? Well, I've got 5 minutes left. So this is what John Mundine said it was about under here. Originally being living trees, the installation is like a forest, an Aboriginal vision of the forest and landscape. Each hollow log is ceremonially a bone coffin. So in essence, the forest is really like a large cemetery of dead Aboriginals, a war cemetery, a war memorial to all those Aboriginals who died defending the country. So the artwork and for what it was about for John, but also the artists and the community, which is why I think they got so enthusiastic about this artwork, was that, as I said, across the lake is the Australian War Memorial, and the Australian War Memorial has refused to recognise the war that occurred within Australia during colonisation. And this is this has been a large debate in Australia for probably 50 years now about why can't the Australian War Memorial include in the memorial something like this. And so the question comes, should this work actually be in the War Memorial? How does its meaning change if it goes in the War Memorial from being an artwork in the National Gallery and a sort of welcome to country? It's sort of like your welcome to country is a cemetery, which is sort of a little weird, or if you like, missing the point of this artwork. Now, the artwork, when John says each is a hollow log, the traditional mortuary ceremony, when someone dies, the hollow log is an important part of that ceremony in which the bones of the deceased are put, and they stay in there until the hollow log rots and the bones go back into the earth. Now, in the mortuary ceremony, the original mortuary ceremony would just be one log for the deceased. So these are dupan, as they're called. These hollow logs are not normally exhibited in this way at all. This is, and John really emphasised this point, this is a contemporary artwork. It's not a mortuary ceremony. None of these logs were used in mortuary ceremonies. They never had, bones in them. It's an imaginative piece. And I just want to conclude. I've only got a few minutes, I know. By now going, we've been more in the nation state and the global, if you like. I want to move to Ramingining, to the local. And I don't know, I doubt if we have anyone from Ramingining here, but Ramingining is exemplary, I guess, of what this conference imagined Voices from the Edge was. But of course, if you live in Ramingining, Ramingining is the centre of everything. It's not an edge at all. So here we are at Ramingining. On the left is an old anthropological photograph from 1936 of a Yolngu mortuary ceremony, what it looked like. But on your right there is the Bulla Bulla Art Centre in Ramingining and what it now looks like and what has become of these poles, because this traditional mortuary ceremony is no longer performed. The poles have become artworks which are bought and sold on the market through Bulla Bulla Art Centre. And so Bulla Bulla Art Centre, which I've put under the category of the local, or when I talk about how the local changes in time, is also the global in the local, and also the nation. It's that house, that building. It's how the nation state has intervened into the local Ramingining community, and through which these artworks go out into the world. The art centre being funded by the state. And this is Ramingining. This is what it looks like, a population of about 850. Probably 90% of the people there are Yolngu. And I've put this map of Australia to show you where Arnhem Land is in relationship to the rest of the world. You can see it's actually much closer to Indonesia and Southeast Asia than it is to where I'm living down near Sydney. And I have a map up there on the right, which I can perhaps explain because we're running out of time later more if people want me to. But that red line is that sort of top right-hand bit is where what's called the Yolngu, what we now call the Yolngu nation, live, which is about 5,000 people. There's 3 or 4 major communities, of which Ramingining is one. It has a very interesting history, which I haven't got time to talk to you about, but we can talk about it in discussion. But I'll just end on this point. Ramingining, there's a little blue line I've got going from the photo of Ramingining up to where Ramingining is. Ramingining is a fairly new community that was created back in the 1970s to house people from Milingimbi, because Milingimbi on an island could no longer support that number of people. There just wasn't enough water there. But the main communities, you'll notice, are all on the ocean. And that's because of several hundred years of contact and trade with Indonesian fishermen. And that's where the main missions were created as well. And that's a whole other story about the history of the global and the local, which predates colonisation in Australia. Let's just end it there, because I've only was given half an hour to talk, and we can move in discussion. Is that right, Tamsin, for you?
Yep, that sounds great.
Yeah.
So if anyone has any questions, if you could write your name or the question in the chat, or perhaps you can, I've just changed the view so I can see more people here. Perhaps you could raise your hand. Ian, I don't know if you wanted to stop sharing your screen, and then maybe we can see.
Okay, look, while they're getting their questions together, I'll just show you the next slide.
Perfect.
Which just explains the memorial a little bit. Why the Ramingining people were very interested in this is that back in around 1900, there was a confrontation with cattlemen and a large massacre of Yolngu people. But in the confrontation, the Yolngu, in a way, they won. The cattlemen withdrew, and so this memory and these stories run through this. And the confrontation occurred in the Arafura swamp, which is where Ramingining is against, and the poles had been laid out according to the river, which you can see here, which flows through the Arafura swamp, and each clan group, and there's about a dozen clans actually live in Ramingining, but they decided, or probably David Malungi and Dang Hu and John Mundine decided that this is how they would organise the main clan groups, and some of those little sections are two closely related clans sort of put together in one clump. And so the memorial, and this is how it was installed. This was its second installation, was at the actual entrance of the main gallery. And so where you walked was down the river with the clans on either side. So they've all been arranged, the poles have been arranged according to their clan group. But I'll shut up there and stop sharing my screen.